journey because I didn't want to do that. The one thing I didn't want anything to happen was anything that would bring me back into the prison system. I wanted to get out at the soonest possible time. And when I got out, I wanted to get out with my dignity intact and with opportunities to prosper. So that governed my decision. That's what is the CEO mindset is about. You define success, you create a strategy and document that strategy. For me, documenting that strategy all the way through each of the 9,500 days that I served, it was to develop tools, tactics, and resources that would help me. So for me, it became, I've got to get an education. And that led me to get an undergraduate degree while I was in prison and a master's degree while I was in prison. It led to me wanting to contribute to society in some kind of meaningful, measurable way. And that's what led me to start writing books while I was in prison. And then by writing books, I was developing another tool and tactic, which was building a network of support and building human resources that would help me. And that helped me through the journey. And I've kind of just packaged that into this new project that I call the CEO Mindset. So I'm Michael Santos with Prison Professors, and now we're going to give you a follow-up interview with my new friend, Govan McAbee, a man who served 26 years in federal prison, a man who's only been out of prison after 26 years for less than a year. So we served about the same length of time, but I've been out now, it'll be 7 years for me in August. What was the day in August that you got out?
August 19th.
I got out August the 11th, August the 12th, 2013 is when I finished with the BOP.
Oh, okay.
So it'll be 7 years for me in August. And it's been a good journey. But it's been a journey because it's different from the way that I prepared myself while I was in prison. Now, you said that you had read did you only read one of my books or several of my books?
Just one.
Did you read it at the end of your journey, or where did you read it? Do you know?
I read it at the beginning, and I'm gonna get it again and read it.
I'll send you a digital copy after we hang up. But let me just think a few things right here, because I presume you don't even know how you heard about the book.
I do. It was a guy he was like a lifer, and he just mentioned your name.
Okay. Well, here's the story, Govan. Okay, so you may have read it, you may not remember it, but here's the story. I was just like you, very young when I made bad decisions. I was 20 years old. I saw the movie Scarface and thought it'd be cool to sell cocaine. You didn't do that. Of course, you were involved in a different crime. You were already on a good pathway. It sounds like going to college, studying, working in a good job, but the institutional racism of society really derailed your life. Right. And you responded to that institutional racism in a manner that brought you into the prison system. When I went to prison, I had this wake-up call after I was convicted, but before I was sentenced. So I was facing life without the possibility of parole when I was 23, and I didn't even know what that meant because I'd never been incarcerated before. But one thing I knew was that I hated prison. I hated being in jail. I hated everything about it. And I read a book, just like you'd spoken about, you're named after one of Mandela's contemporaries in the previous episode. And if anybody didn't see the previous episode, I would encourage you. I'll have a link in the show notes before so that you can learn a little bit more about Govan's inspiring journey through prison and his return to society. But when I was still in jail and I hadn't been sentenced, I read this book about Socrates. And that book completely changed my mindset. It caused me to stop thinking about what was going on in my life and to start thinking about how did I want to emerge from prison? What was going to be the best possible outcome? And now I teach a lot about that because it says what really you have to do, Govan, is develop a CEO mindset. And if you've probably, I don't know if you've seen much of my content, but I speak a lot about the CEO mindset, and effectively tells us we have to be the CEO of our own life. We've got to start by defining success. What is the best possible outcome? If you can do that, then you could start doing the reverse engineering, saying, okay, well, what's the strategy that I am going to pursue? And I kind of heard that from you in your previous episode where you said you took a series of jobs that were basically entry-level jobs, But in the course of a year, you went from earning $10 an hour to getting yourself up to about a 50% raise from that to more than $15 an hour, all while you were in the halfway house, number one, which is impressive. And number two, what's also impressive is the mindset to even take a $10 an hour job. Because as you know, a lot of guys get out of prison and they feel that they're entitled to something. They feel like they have to get paid a lot more money. And because they don't find a marketplace that's receptive to them, they revert to the type of behavior that a lot of times brings them back into problems with the law. You haven't done that. And I started thinking about that very early in my journey because I didn't want to do that. The one thing I didn't want anything to happen was anything that would bring me back into the prison system. I wanted to get out at the soonest possible time. And when I got out, I wanted to get out with my dignity intact and with opportunities to prosper. So that governed my decision. That's what is the CEO mindset is about. You define success, you create a strategy and document that strategy. For me, documenting that strategy all the way through each of the 9,500 days that I served, it was to develop tools, tactics, and resources that would help me. So for me, it became, I've got to get an education. And that led me to get an undergraduate degree while I was in prison and a master's degree while I was in prison. It led to me wanting to contribute to society in some kind of meaningful, measurable way. And that's what led me to start writing books while I was in prison. And then by writing books, I was developing another tool and tactic, which was building a network of support and building human resources that would help me. And that helped me through the journey. And I've kind of just packaged that into this new project that I call the CEO mindset. You define success, you create a strategy, and you document it so that you can tell other people about it. Two, you've got to develop the tools, tactics, and resources that will help you execute on that model, just like you're doing right now. You're keeping your expenses low. You're banking capital in cash. And then three, you've got to measure your progress every single day. So
that's right.
That powerful concept is really not unique to me. It's what I learned from leaders and masterminds, and they helped me develop that mindset while I was climbing through prison. And because I did that, I had a very different experience when I got out. While I was incarcerated, by the time I was in my 8th year, I already had my master's degree in prison. And by the time I was in my 10th year, I was in a PhD program. And then the Bureau of Prisons stopped me because that was around the time that you came in. As you remember, they were building up that mass incarceration movement. They'd stopped the Pell Grant. A lot of people were, you may remember the Zimmer bill, where, the tough on prisons bill that where people were really wanted to see more people locked up. And because of that, my warden stopped me from getting a PhD. And at the time I was at McKean, which you may remember was called the Dream McKean. And I architected my way to get there. Yeah. And then they had the riots of 1994, 1995.
I remember that.
They shipped all the leaders out. And although I was not a gang leader, I had a lot of influence on the compound. I was a teacher and so on. And I had a lot of influence. So they shipped me out. I thought I was going back to the USP, to Lewisburg, but they ended up sending me to Ferreton, where when I was at Ferreton, I had the same problem where they would not allow me to get my PhD. And the way they could do that, Govan, was since they controlled the mailroom, they would stop my books coming from the university. Wow. And if I couldn't get the books, I couldn't do the coursework. So I had raised my own money while I was in prison to pay for my education by building this model. And when they stopped that model, I had to shift my focus because education and fitness had been my whole journey all the way through there, up through my first decade in prison. And after I got my, when they stopped me, I shifted my focus to what came next. I think it was law school. I wrote about this in the book. I went to law school because they had the law library, so I could get the law books right there in the law library, but I also could get books from Amazon. So I didn't need the type of academic books that the universities to get my doctorate. Right. I felt I could get a law degree. So I started going to law school, but I didn't like it because it was not the same level of excellence. Like the other schools was Hofstra University and Mercer University, really good schools, whereas the law school that accepted me was a correspondence program, and it really felt like a diploma mill. So I didn't like it, and I didn't need another degree. I felt I had a master's degree. What I needed to do at that point was I recognized it doesn't make any sense for me to try and be a model inmate. That's not going to get me anywhere. Nobody's going to hire me because I'm a model inmate. So I started thinking about, what do I need to have when I'm out? And I need to have money. I need to have capital. So it was around my 10th year that I set a goal of saying, by the time I get out of prison, I'm going to have enough money in the bank that I can live a full year without needing any money. And that became my goal. Say, I'm going to have enough money in the bank that I'm going to get out. I will not need anything from anybody, and I'll have enough cash in the bank to buy everything I need and to live a full year without needing any money. So I set that goal when I was in about my 10th year. Then I still had 16 years to go. So I started doing, initially, somebody asked me to help him with an appeal. And he paid me $2,000 for that. And that was the first money I ever had in prison. Other than that, I was living on commissary money that my sister and my parents would send me, $100 or a couple $100 a month, and that was it. But now I had $2,000, and that was like a lot of money back then, right? That was in 1996, and I hadn't had money since I got locked up. So, but I'd been studying, and I understood the stock market at that time because I'd studied a lot about. I studied not only in school, but also that became a very an important part of my day, to study the financial markets and learn about business. And that was, as you may know, it was the dawn of the internet. So, I'd never sent an email. I'd never used a cell phone, because those didn't exist when I went to prison in 1987. And so I was reading about the internet, and I think it's kind of like you. The internet didn't really exist when you went. So when I was in there, I used to dream about the internet. I said, what is it? How does it work? Because I'm reading about it, but it's kind of like reading about tennis without playing tennis. You can read all the books you want about tennis, but if you don't play, you don't really learn how to play. So I kept reading these books, and now I had $2,000, and I wanted to be a part of it. And the only way I could be a part of it was to invest. So I started to invest $2,000, and within a couple of months, I turned that into $6,000. Wow. Now you've got real money. And so I had this plan that I'm going to keep doing that. And by 1999, I'd made $1 million in prison from the stock market. Yeah, and starting only with the 2,000.
Can I ask you a question, Michael, real quick? Hold your thought. Because I studied the markets too, since I was in my school of thoughts. What kind of investments was you making? Was you in equities? I mean, was you in options?
No, only equities. And I used margin. So I had $2,000. My first trade was for Yahoo, which was the equivalent of like Google today. But it was the start. And I bought it I had $2,000 in cash. I could borrow $1,000 on margin, which allowed me to buy, $3,000 worth of stock. And as I recall, when I first bought it, it was trading at like maybe $50. So for $3,000, I could buy what? 100 shares would be $500, 300 shares. Okay. But it was the dawn of the internet. So that $50 really ramped up to about $100 really quickly. And then the stock split. So when it split, now I had 600 shares, and they were back at $50, and it started to rise again. And let's say it went to 100. That $600 became that position that I only paid $3,000 for became $6,000.
Right.
And because it becomes $6,000, now I had $1,000 in debt. Remind you, right? I had $6,000 in stock, $1,000 in debt because I borrowed $1,000.
Right.
And so I had $5,000 in equity, but now I could borrow more. So I kept leveraging my way up until I had a goal of having 1,000 shares of Yahoo and 1,000 shares of America Online. And those were the two kick-ass stocks of that era. And when I had that, there were a couple of days when I would make more than $100,000 a day in prison.
I know.
And so that was really changing my life.
Wow.
But there was something about that, Govan, is that money, it was like illusory because I couldn't touch it. Because I couldn't spend anything when I was in prison, number one. And number two, it wasn't income. It was just a balance sheet going up.
Right.
And what I really wanted to have was income. Because now at the point where I had $1 million, but I had $1 million in equity and $2 million worth of stock. So I owed the bank $1 million, and I did all that from inside of a prison. So I teach a lot about this, but what happens is when you're highly leveraged, like I was, in heavily concentrated positions, like I was, in what are called high beta stocks, meaning they're really volatile, okay? You make a lot of money, but you lose a lot of money when the market comes down.
Right, absolutely.
And over a couple of days, I lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that $1 million quickly turned into about 600,000. And then I decided, hey, this is real money, and I got to change my life because it can have a monumental shift in my life. So I sold at 600,000, which meant I had to pay a lot in tax in prison. Now, my goal originally had been to hold this for long-term capital gain so I wouldn't pay as much tax. But when I saw the $1 million turn to 600,000, I couldn't keep holding it. I had to make a shift. So I shifted, and that meant I had to sell my position, pay back a partner, because I had a partner provide me with more money. And it left me with about $100,000 in the bank when I was probably in my 13th year. So I was about halfway through my sentence. Maybe I was in my 14th or 15th year. And that shifted my everything, because now I've got a little money. $100,000 is a lot of money when you're in prison, because I said, okay, I've got my goal now. That's enough money for me to be able to get out, and I don't need a job. I can build my business when I get out. So it was a remember, defining success, tools, tactics, and resources, measuring it along the way. But I can tell you that losing $900,000 in prison and I lost it. I mean, that was, if I'd have sold like a week before, I would have had $1 million. And even if I paid the tax on it, I still would have had 600,000 in liquidity.
Right.
And that hurt almost as badly as getting a 45-year sentence. Because I just thought, God, that's a lot of cash that just gone.
Yeah.
But I still had $100,000. And so I learned really to live in gratitude, because I started with nothing. And I knew this was going to change my life, and I needed to find something else to do while I was in prison. So that's what led me to become an author. And I began writing. And first I wrote for academic books that are used in universities. And that led me to further developing my strong support network, where people would write me, and I developed mentor relationships, and people would come to visit me in prison. And it is actually what led to me getting married while I was in prison. Did you know I got married while I was in prison?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. So I got married when I was in my 16th year, and my wife came into my life, and I told her my plan. You know, I said the same thing. I got to define success. I got to have tools, tactics, and resources. I got to measure it every way. And I said, and I had like $100,000. So that was one of the reasons that I could get married, because I could give that money to my wife and support her. But I told her, I said, look, I got 10 years to go. I think when she came into my life, I still had 11. She came in 2002. I got it on 30. I had 11 years to go. But I told her, I said, I'm a prisoner, and I know what I am. I was a high profile prisoner, and that meant administrators locked me in the shoe a lot. And I didn't care about that. You know, that didn't bother me at all. And I knew that, you know, they'd threaten me, they're going to send me to higher security. I said, look, dude, I did 7 years in the USP. I could go there anytime. Right. There's plenty of guys I could do well in the USP. But I was in a low at that time. And I went from USP to medium to low, and that's when I married my wife. And I said to her, I'm going to write books about the prison system, and it can get me in trouble if I do that. And I know that. And I'm going to do this with my eyes wide open. I'm doing this. I feel proud of what I am doing, and I think it's good for society. And I think mass incarceration is one of the greatest social injustices of our time, and I want to make it better. So writing books was one way that I could do that, or try to do that. And I also wanted to build upon my career when I got out. So because I started to write those books, I built this massive support system, and I began then, I gave my wife my money. She went on to become a nurse. She used that money so that she could go to school, and she became a nurse because just as I anticipated, they began transferring me. And so I got transferred from Fort Dix, but the reason that I got transferred, at the end, was because my security points dropped when I went below 10 years. So they sent me to a camp in Colorado, in Florence. And I got to the camp, and when I was there is when my big book came out called Inside Life Behind Bars in America. And that's a very graphic look at USPs and so on. And that got a lot of publicity. And because it got a lot of publicity, they locked me in the shoe, and they sent me from Florence. They were going to send me to some prison in Texas, but I was skilled, so I knew how to litigate my way through that, and I prevailed when they tried to give me a shot. I prevailed, and they sent me back to a camp, but this time in Lompoc, California. And I went to California camp, and I continued doing the work there, and they locked me in the hole. Funny story, the warden there it was the captain at the time. He locked me in the hole in Lompoc and said they were sending me to higher security, but I litigated again, and I prevailed. And then they sent me to another camp in Taft, California, where I was for like the last 5 years or so. And then I wrote a lot of books while I was in the camp in Taft. And then I went to Atwater. I didn't get a shot. They sent me to Atwater because I was an old law prisoner, right? I had 45 years, but I was under the old law, and there were only so many prisons that had parole boards. So I had a little bit of parole eligibility, and they sent me to Atwater so I could go to the board. But when I got to Atwater, there's so few old law prisoners that it was going to take too long to go to the board. So they said, look, we'll give you 1 year halfway house if you waive the board. I said, let's go, let me out. So that's when I got out in August. Okay. And when I got out in August, Govan, I said, within 5 years, I'll have my first $1 million. That became a goal of mine. And I had a 000 credit score, but I still had $100,000 in the bank. Not because of the $100,000 from the stock market, because I'd given all that to my wife to put her through school, and she lived on that for 10 years while I was doing my last 10 years in prison. But I began ghostwriting books for other people in prison. And I would charge anywhere from minimum of $10,000 to made as much as $50,000 from people in prison. And I was building my cash. But I wasn't investing now because I knew I was going to need capital. And I got out of prison. I had about $100,000 in the bank, and I'd also been an author. So I'd published a lot of books, and I got out, and within a couple of days, a newspaper wanted to do a story on me because I'd also had my own website, and I began publishing about my website, and I had a big following. So the editor of a big newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, wrote me when I was like maybe out for a week or so, and said he wanted to do a story on me and asked if I'd participate. And I said, for sure. That led to a lot of speaking opportunities in corporations and universities. And when I was giving a presentation at San Francisco State, they, after listening, they asked me if I wanted a job, and I was still in the halfway house. I hadn't finished my sentence yet. And I said, what do you want me to do? Mow the lawn? What are you looking for? And they said, no, we want you to be a professor here. And I'd never been, on a university campus ever before I went to prison. So the guy said, yeah, I'd love to. I said, well, how did this come about? He said, well, when I was in grad school, your books were assigned reading in our course. So I've been following you for 10 years. Wow. And so I'd laid all this groundwork, Govan, for this pathway to success. And then I leveraged it to open business opportunities as well, because I'd had all of this background and this credibility. So I didn't have a credit score, but I'd done a lot. So I would go to business leaders and I'd tell them, you're a businessman. I want you to look at what I'm going to become in 5 years. This is what I did while I was in prison, and I could show them all of my books, and I could show them my business plans and so on and so forth. And I persuaded them to finance me in starting to acquire real estate. And so I started to acquire real estate in 2012. And over the next 5 years, I put together about probably $7-8 million worth of deals, all during those first 5 years of liberty. So I'd set a goal of having $1 million, but I built a lot bigger than that during that period of time. But it was always very important for me to try and create new content that I would bring back into jails and prisons to show other people why this is a great social injustice. And one of the things that I teach, Govan, is that people need to live in the world as it exists, not as they want it to be. And that means you've got to realize that there are going to be people that judge me because I'm, Cuban American, or because I was in prison for 26 years, or because the bad decisions that I made when I was 20. But that doesn't give me an excuse. I've got to succeed anyway. And that's where I teach about the CEO mindset. And this is what got me through the journey in prison. This is what made me successful when I came home. And so I created this course that I sell to jails and prisons. And so now, ironically, I told you I did a lot of public speaking. When I was speaking at a judicial conference, I think it was in 2015 or 16, I'm in this conference, and remember I told you the captain locked me up at Lompoc? Well, he was now a warden at Atwater. And he came and he told me, hey, you remember me? And I said, of course I remember you. And he just said, I'm really proud of what you've been able to do. He said, would you consider coming to USP and speak to the guys there? And I said, I'd love to come and speak, but it's not about coming and speaking and giving a motivational speech. I want to show people the pathway to succeed. And I'd like to create a course and have you become a client. And that's how the BOP became a client of mine. I
like that.
I sold courses to USP Atwater, to Victorville, to ADX in Florence. They'd bring me out there to the ADX, and I spoke there. And at Florence USP, at Florence FCI, and even at the camp. And now I've created a lot of courses that I sell to every prison in the state of California and a lot of other places. But all of this, Govan, is because I started sowing seeds very early in prison. And it's like the same thing that you are doing right now. You are sowing seeds. And so that was the pathway that got me through. And I think that what we should do, we've already spoken for a half an hour. We should probably break this one and have another question about saying, okay, how could you use these lessons to accelerate your pathway to success? Now that I've given you the background, does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, sweet.
Absolutely.
So let's close this episode right now. I'm Michael Sanchez with Prison Professors, talking to my new friend, Govan McAbee. You can get his contact information through the show notes below. His Gmail is just mcabeegovan@gmail.com. And he's got an 8-digit click Instagram page as well. So I would encourage you to reach out and give him your ideas. If you can find a way to use a person who'd gone through 26 years in prison but emerged with a very strong mindset, reach out to Govan, because he likely has a lot to contribute and a lot to offer. And I'm going to spend the next episode giving Govan some ideas or suggestions on what I think he could be doing that he could choose to use or not, and I hope this is a value to you. And if you like this kind of content, I do hope that you will subscribe to the Prison Professors YouTube channel. We produce content every single day. I would also like it if you supported our sponsor at cbdtv.com. I'll be telling Govan about how I created that company as a vehicle to help generate resources that I could teach and inspire more people who are going through the system. I truly believe mass incarceration is one of the greatest social injustices of our time, and we want you to do something about it because it influences every American citizen. And we want more people coming out like Govan with opportunities to succeed, and you can do that by being a part of this endeavor. Thanks.